Welcome everyone to the anniversary series, as what do you know, today on the day of this release, a big Pixar movie released to this date several years ago. Funnily enough, we just did a video on one of these yesterday in the form of Pixar's Up, and now we're talking about Pixar's Finding Nemo. With a whole age gap of 6 years between them, apparently back in this era of Pixar days, the very end of May was their go-to for release dates. Nowadays, it's the end of June. Wonder why. Interesting. Marketing. But anyway, yes, let's talk about Finding Nemo. The original, right? This movie, being 21 years old now, ironically enough, surrounded by water, is now allowed to drink. Actually, it was based in Australia, so what's the drinking age in Australia? Well, this could have been able to drink 3 years ago. Great, I'm glad that they are normal. That's coming from someone from Britain. Legally, our 4-year-olds are allowed to drink as long as an adult buys the alcohol for them and they drink it in a house. Seriously, our laws are weird. Oh, no, sorry, I checked. Apparently, it's illegal to give alcohol to children under 5, which means it's legal if they're 6! Anyway, I'm already getting detoured. Finding Nemo as a movie is, to me, an absolute masterclass Pixar classic. Is that a surprise to say? I don't think so, but at the same time, I kind of feel like Finding Nemo isn't really noticed as often as it should be. Like, when you tell someone, think of Pixar, they'll think Toy Story, maybe The Incredibles, Monsters, Inc., or, the latest stuff, Inside Out. Finding Nemo somehow falls to the wayside and into the ocean, Still, this movie really strikes to my core personally. It could be because I am very biased here. This movie came out in 2003. I was prime, finally getting consciousness, able to fully watch a movie in a cinema. So I'm pretty sure I remember going to the cinema to watch this as one of my first movies I've ever seen, other than like the Rugrats movie or something, and having a staff worker ask if I wanted to be the one to turn it on the projector. And so I did, and then miraculously missed the family-killing massacre that's the start of this movie. Really, I got the best ultimate experience I could have done. As far as I'm concerned, Marlin and Nemo were just born exactly as they were at the start of the movie. This is one of those movies as well that I watched so much as a kid because I like to listen to VHS tapes when I went to sleep because children are fussy like that. I have the entire sound of this movie ingrained into my long-term memory, and having a Randy Newman soundtrack for a movie like this is just so stellar. And the vibes that they specifically went with for that underwaterly relaxation vibe brings a sort of comfort that I feel isn't really felt in Pixar movies anymore. Now maybe that's just because Randy Newman's moved on to a different tone or is outright not the composer anymore for some movies. And that's absolutely fair enough, but I don't know, there's something so calming about Finding Nemo as a movie. Despite the fact that it's in the world of sharks, and that becomes a threat at one point. There's underwater landmines, for God's sake, in this movie, and I'm calling it my comfort movie. Oh, actually, hold back on that. It's not Randy Newman doing the soundtrack. It was Thomas Newman, his cousin. Man, maybe I'm a bit more hipster than I realize. Oh, and semi-bittersweetly, apparently the score was nominated for an Oscar for original score and lost to The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Okay, fair enough. I'll allow it. Now, as a story, it's a pretty interesting direction for an animated kids movie. As it's quite notoriously known now, a lot of the early Pixar movie storylines were all depicted during the same lunch sequence by a bunch of the higher-ups at Pixar coming up with all the ideas at once, generally basing it around kids' fantasies and what they think about. What if our toys came to life? What if we made a movie about the monsters under the bed or in the closet? What if we did a movie about a son losing their mother, being taken away, and then trying to be found by their father through the ocean? It doesn't really roll off the tongue in the same way. Even still, I think the final output is a brilliant excerpt of just a lot of prowess in so many different directions. On a cultural front, it's very nice that this movie is based in Australia, and so there are some aptly casted Australian folk involved, which is always nice to see as someone from Britain. Most of our representation really comes from Aardman movies and villains. You can always tell who's a villain by the one that starts speaking British. It's practically a spoiler. But then similarly, this whole movie is a departure from the past 4 Pixar movies at this point in the timeline, as of course it's all set underwater. It requires a whole new lighting engine and physics that they have to meander with and work out the animation for. Sure, Monsters, Inc. actually had to have a whole actual rebirthed system of fur, but I'm sure that the underwater elements of Finding Nemo came with its own hurdles as well. It's Pixar at their prime when they were being the trailblazers of animation. And I think the limitations of trying to find the boundaries of animation at the time is what makes some of these early movies so good. And truly a testament to time. Even now, looking at elements of, hey, our protagonist character is literally disabled with a dodgy fin, that's the kind of thing that I never even thought about as a kid, but must have been stellar to see if you were in that kind of position, even vaguely. It's put in there as kind of a point of how Nemo is potentially looking like a weak, vulnerable character and then goes to grow to become their own strengthened person anyway with confidence and not being such an over-helicoptering parent. That's the theme going on there. But it's also just a shock that that was a representative choice they chose to make on installment number 5, which, when I say out loud, kind of sounds like a lot, but considering 1 and 3 are literally the same series, maybe we'll give it a pass. Although even then as well, Toy Story 2, Woody loses an arm, essentially. That's Pixar has a thing for limbs in the early days, huh? Because it makes sense that later on they switched to talent disability for Monsters University. Now, of course, with this movie being one that I saw when I was 6 years old, I actually didn't know a lot of the production details behind this movie. You know, it was a little bit before my time, to say the least, to think about these things. Turns out, actually, the pre-production of this movie began in early 1997, so I was a good almost 1 by then. Not even, I wasn't even 6 months. Being put together during the post-production of A Bug's Life, and the fact that this screenplay was all the way finished by the time they'd practically started the movie was, at the time, very unusual for an animated movie. Inspired, of course, by the director and screenplay writer Andrew Stanton's own relationship with his own son being a bit too overprotective while spending time at an aquarium. Looking into it a little further as well, it wasn't so much technological advances that were required to make the fish animate using underwater physics, it was just actual human research. All sorts of animators were taking scuba diving and taking all sorts of courses to learn the ways that fish actually end up moving, which is fascinating to see. Hey, thank you for making halfway through this video. This is the quick cheeky plug to tell you to subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know your thoughts of Finding Nemo. Now's the chance to talk about it, with it being 21 years old on the dot. How old were you when you saw this movie, and does it strike to you in the same way it does me? Is there anyone who's seen this movie in a non-nostalgic format? I'd be very curious to hear all opinions you've got on this movie, and now I'll tell you the second half of my opinions and thoughts as we go into the rest of the anniversary of Finding Nemo. Anyway, as I can find it, the production didn't seem to go with too many hurdles. It took 6 years from beginning to end, sure, but that seemingly was pretty standard for an animated movie in the late 90s, early 2000s. And as smooth as it was during production, it was even more smooth once it came out, apparently becoming the highest grossing animated film at the time, and the second highest grossing film of all of 2003. And it certainly made a profit, earning $940 million at the box office, almost $1 billion, and it's not even a mainstay title like Mario or Toy Story 4, you know? It's just a random 2003 fish movie. Made by the biggest animation studio at the time, but, you know, still. And trailblazing the way for Pixar earning Oscars and getting the very first Best Animated Feature for them. It is said to be the best-selling DVD of all time as well, or at least up to 2006, as Wikipedia stops counting at that point. And of course, looking at it 21 years later, it's not surprisingly actually that not so much talked about. I sort of mentioned earlier that it's not the one people think as a mascot so much, but also as a franchise, it surprisingly hasn't gotten very far. It could very well be because it's in the super early phase of Pixar. They weren't looking to make franchises out of everything early on, only with Toy Story really, and this movie didn't necessarily need it. It's about finding Nemo, and in the end, they find Nemo. What a surprise, you know? Of course, eventually this movie got a sequel in the form of the Finding Dory movie in 2016. And this one, again, it's, you know, it kind of lowers the quality of the franchise, but not to an offensive degree. You know, it was kind of covering a lot of the same tropes and wasn't too particularly interesting. The fact that we lost the father-son relationship from the first movie kind of negates the whole thematic resonance of the first movie into turning the second movie, but maybe that's more reflective of Pixar in 2016 as a story. Either way, let's not get into late-game Pixar era stuff. Let's talk about the early stuff, because that's the good stuff, and what is the real anniversary. You know, Finding Dory came out on a weird date. Ugh, June 17th? Ugh, not my Pixar. May 30th is where it's at. Interestingly though, talking about release dates, Finding Nemo actually was also in new territory for Pixar, as this was the very first movie by Pixar to be released in May. And not just May, in any month at all that wasn't November. This was the first summer movie that Pixar released. Up to this point, everything else was a vague Thanksgiving Christmas movie, I guess. Which I guess makes a lot of sense considering there were a lot of presents in Toy Story 1. I mean, you can argue that's a birthday thing, but, you know, kind of on theme. And this movie feels like a summery movie, more so than all the others. Bug's Life, they're worrying about going into famine over the winter, so yeah, autumn-based movie. This is proper sunlight and seas in the Australian Gulf. Does Australia have a Gulf? No. It has golf, the sport, but not a golf. Oh god, I'm uncultured. And you can probably tell the fact that it's a nice, summery, bright light world, even though it's not, you know, in direct sunlight, because you got the sun rays coming in through the water, which again, just looks brilliant. What I do think is interesting on my most recent rewatch is actually looking at the style of comedy, since 2003 had a very different tone for jokes compared to anything post-Marvel, you know? So with that in mind, you know, there's a lot of jokes about like overly intellectual lines or like describing toilets as porcelain. It's like the kind of more... I wouldn't say it's more intellectual humor, but it's just a lot less quippy, and I find that very refreshing. And whilst I was saying earlier that the idea of this movie being made, it doesn't really fit to the idea of kids' fascinations, where it really excels in is just showcasing aquatic animals in like almost a museum form. When you think of underwater creatures, you think fish, sharks, and jellyfish. And then from there, they can expand into all sorts of other territories, specifically clownfish and manta rays, seahorses, and I guess seagulls as well, aquatic, sure. It's a really nice display of showcasing what there is in this big, mysterious world that kids could be interested in. I'm not surprised they made The Good Dinosaur eventually. Honestly, they should have made a dinosaur movie way sooner. They could have capitalized on that so easily. And of course, in the sequel as well, they add all sorts of other creatures, whales that we actually get to talk to vaguely, and octopi. It's nice. I think there's a lot of room for this sequel to continue further, but it's the narrative string between Nemo and his dad that really is the heart of this movie, which is probably why it hasn't really successfully expanded in too many other directions, other than a calm your kids down, the fish are animating on the screen on Disney+. As a movie that's slowly getting buried by the growing library of Pixar movies as a whole, I surprisingly end up forgetting about this movie a lot, but if I really had to think about it, I think this movie easily goes into the top 5 somehow of all of my Pixar movies in a tier list. It needs to squeeze in there somehow, because I have such unending love for like the tone of this movie. Minus the massacre at the beginning. And I don't think that is an exclusive experience, as even nowadays on Rotten Tomatoes, as much as that's not the best setting for reviews, we're going with it anyway, it has a solid 99% there. This movie resonates with children in a way that perhaps more recent Pixar movies and animated movies in general just don't quite do. And surprisingly enough, it's kind of slow. Yes, there are action sequences in there. I don't need to remind you of the landmines and the massacre at the beginning. But for being this big and blue world that moves gently and slowly, it has a real comforting vibe that fits to 20 years ago children's entertainment. While I'm sure 70% of the praise I have for this movie comes from Thomas Newman's soundtrack work, just everything coming together that makes the final result of Finding Nemo just makes this a solid Pixar classic that I'm not surprised is 21 years old. It is an old movie, and yet it stands the test of time, surprisingly already better than the sequel because it's Ellen DeGeneres up front and center, you know? She had a shelf life of 6 years after the movie, considering she was cancelled that soon afterwards. And they even managed to turn around such a classic cliche of, oh, short-term memory loss, and turn it into a great character design, in the original movie at least. What an accolade on that alone. But yeah, Finding Nemo is now 21 years old, and what a surprise, I have unending praise for an absolute Pixar classic masterpiece. The only thing dated about it is the fact that it released alongside Knick Knack, which in and itself had an incredibly controversial character model the first time round. But other than that, that's all I have to say for the anniversary of Pixar's Finding Nemo. My name's been Daz. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this video. Do tell me your unending love or maybe mediocre takes on Finding Nemo as a movie. I'd love to hear people's thoughts. Keep the discussion going over on our YouTube comments or over on our Discord server. I shall end it off there and see you all in a little bit.